guys want to say?
Good.
Okay. Hi everyone. I'm going to give my presentation on the Romani people, specifically their role and their experiences in the Holocaust. And so, here we go. Yeah, my research question today is kind of looking at the Romani people and looking at different historians' kind of perspective on if the Romani people were racialized during the Holocaust, or were they just kind of prejudiced and stereotypes based on like existing stereotypes that have been kind of perpetuated during time since their existence and kind of since their migration from India, and kind of how do these shared archives with the Jewish people complicate their experience and kind of give us a more difficult understanding of unique experiences between Romani and Jewish people. So at first I'm gonna give you guys a brief kind of overview. I'm assuming you guys all know about World War II and the Holocaust and kind of what led up to it and Hitler's ideological war, but it was an ideological war based on race. Hitler believed that the Aryans were the superior race and that the Jews were the epitome of the anti-race, a parasite, a stain on the Jewish bloodline, and that they needed to be essentially erased from the earth and eradicated. As you see, I have an image kind of like the roots of Nazi ideology. So this stems from like eugenics, social Darwinism, Christian anti-Judaism, just believing that there was a superior race and that there were other races and other groups of people that did not meet their standards and that needed to be killed off so that you know, the superior Aryan race could have more space and spread out across Europe. So I wanted to look at how gypsies were affected by the Holocaust because they're traditionally not talked about. Usually it's only looked at through the Jewish lens. So Romani people are an Indo-Aryan ethnic group who are travelers or inerrant people traveling from India, and they live in Europe and America. In the sources I looked at, they kind of use gypsy and Roma people interchangeably, although gypsy is traditionally a pejorative word and is not usually used, but in the sources I used, it was used interchangeably, so I just wanted to clarify that. But gypsies have been viewed as asocials and inferior, who kind of threaten the race. They've traditionally just been looked down upon in their history, just because of their kind of way of life as travelers, as traditionally poorer people who don't really have a set culture, no kind of written oral history. But between 1933 and 1945, Sinti and Roma people suffered Nazi persecution and were sent to various concentration camps and death camps because they were viewed as an inferior people, along with blacks, disabled people, other Polish people, and so forth. So I just wanted to look at the death toll of the Holocaust and see how they were affected. So as we know, around 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust by Nazis. However, the archives for the Roma people are rather kind of spread out, and based on the sources I looked at, the numbers changed very drastically, but historians estimated up to 500,000 Roma people were killed during the Holocaust, but that number also goes down to only 200,000, so it's kind of missing a decent chunk amount of people who, you know, they're not really sure what happened because there are no specific documents that gave a complete and total list. But as we see, just to give a full perspective, up to 250,000 people were killed who had disabilities, and around 1.8 million non-Jewish Polish citizens also were killed during the Holocaust. So, going back, so the basis of my argument is that gypsies were the racial victims of the Nazis. Nazi policy was aimed towards the physical expulsion or annihilation of all groups or races deemed undesirable or non-Aryan. One of the authors I looked at, he argued it is absurd to argue that Nazi intentions differ among various persecuted groups. They all kind of believed that they were inferior, so that they needed to be killed, and then they were sent to these camps. Another historian I looked at, Tyner, also argued on this point. He said that they were further described as parasites, congenital criminals, asocial, and a threat to the purity of German blood. There were only two peoples to whom this description consistently applied, Jews and Gypsies. So we see how they were racialized and they were viewed as inferior, so that gave the Nazis an excuse or a reason for their killings. But it's more complex than just looking at that they were just racialized. As I said earlier, the Holocaust is often viewed only in the lens of Jewish suffering. It's not really specified to just Romani experiences. A lot of the stuff I looked at how historians suggested that there were issues with the archives because Gypsy survivors of the Holocaust did not really write down their experiences or their stories, just because of their tradition as like traveling people who don't have an oral history. So if they don't have an oral history, how can you expect them to kind of, after this moment in time, reflect back and publish what has happened? So the Romani genocide is often pushed to the side and not really fully acknowledged as it. It's only traditionally referred to as like the Jewish Holocaust. So kind of my argument is kind of like twofold. And Romani people are consistently stereotyped before and after the Holocaust. But looking at my counter argument, I want to explore how some historians do disagree with the fact that they were racialized, and that they do argue that they were kind of just prejudiced, and this long-standing prejudice as traveling people. So I have a quote here by an author, Gunter. Despite the increased use of racial rhetoric, many Nazi measures directed against the Gypsies continue to include Gypsy-like adherents, the so-called white Gypsies. Although they were German origin and were not Gypsies racially, they lived and conducted themselves like Gypsies. So it goes to show that the Nazis attacked even those who were deemed kind of German. They were Aryan, but because they had the characteristics of traveling people, and because they acted like Gypsies, the Nazis were prejudiced towards them, and they were also included in their attack and got sent to concentration camps and whatnot. I have another quote from another article. It kind of went back and forth. There was a correspondence between a historian and a commenter on the article. She said, "It is clear that the attitude towards the Gypsies was a mixture of anti-Gypsy prejudice and hatred on one hand, and racialistic hallucinations on the other hand." So we see how this is kind of like more complex. She also continues, "Whereas therefore in Germany, many pure wandering Gypsies were the subject of arguments in which Himmler took a slightly less murderous line from that of the party. In the East, it was the wandering Gypsies who were to be killed." So we see how it was more complex, and it wasn't, in the counter argument, I'm not sure if it's quite fair to say that they were purely racialized, because you see Gypsies who were even more German than not were also included in their wrath. So I just kind of reiterate the dangers of like limited historical perspective, as I said earlier. Only looking at the Holocaust through a Jewish lens kind of like does a disservice to other groups who were also affected during this time. So I have a quote from another historian. "Debate itself tends to generate into a historical analysis in which asserts the uniqueness of a particular group experience, therefore entitling it to exclusive use of terms as genocide and Holocaust, while reserving such terms as tragedy and atrocity for other groups. For example, when we talk about the Holocaust, it's traditionally talked about the Jewish Holocaust, but then when we also talk about it, it's kind of only referred to as like the Romani tragedy, or like the Romani, it's to a lesser extent because we view Jews as the primary victims, which they were, but it's incorrect to only say that they were, to not properly acknowledge how the other groups faced these experiences." So I also have another quote, just kind of exploring these dangers of only looking at one perspective. "As each group of victims tended to write its own history of the Holocaust, the larger Jewish communities obviously dominated post-war historiography, while the less articulate communities of Gypsies largely remained silent." So again, as I was reiterating, it's kind of like a twofold issue. We can't really know if, it's just kind of difficult to fully get a picture of what is occurring when the historiography is not really written about. And then another quote I have is, "Scholars interested in Romani testimonies have little choice but to consult archives created primarily to document the murder of European Jews. One victim group controls a large percentage of the other." So I just want to explore how like this is difficult and needs to be acknowledged when looking at this, However, despite this, I do believe that gypsy groups were racialized, and that their prejudice was kind of just added on. That they were viewed as inferior, they were viewed as a parasite, they were viewed as something that needed to be killed off to kind of save the biologically pure Aryan race. But it's important to acknowledge that their stories need to be separated from each other to gain a fuller perception of their lived experiences. And the continued stereotyping kind of affects this, but I do believe that they were racialized during the Holocaust.